Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that everything in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, the author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Love Marriage.
And another forthcoming novel. Is this not the case?
That's the rumor. And I know you're finishing up a novel too. So how do you relax while other people have your manuscript? I'm kind of living in hurry up and wait land at the moment. And so I've been killing time watching The Mandalorian.
I would love to be in hurry up and wait land. I am not in hurry up and wait land. I also, because I mean, you're on a sabbatical right now. That makes life easier, But I did watch The Mandalorian, while grading papers and doing 5 other things, and it was good. But that was also that was before the whole Gina Carano deal.
Yeah, Gina Carano, aka Cara Dune, who, as Deadline reported, shared a TikTok post comparing the current divided political climate in the U.S. to Nazi Germany.
Maybe not the best idea. I also heard she got fired.
Yes.
And you were going to talk about some other things that she did.
Well, so I started the show at the beginning, just, a couple days ago, and I'm watching these episodes in which Cara Dune, her character, plays a huge role. And I got to say, I feel some ick. She had months of controversial social media activity, and I love the show so far, but I'm also 100% fine with her being canned. And other things she said, like mocking people sharing their pronouns by changing her own pronouns to beep, bop, boop, a la R2D2, posting
which is not cool. That's not cool.
No. Posting things supportive of QAnon, saying the election was a fraud.
Did I ever tell you this, Sugi? This is going to surprise you because it's on the script, that I knew Dean Cain in college.
Oh my God, I was such a fan of him until I discovered that he was horrendous.
Yep. Yuppie-duppie. He was dating Brooke Shields at Princeton when I was there. Yep. Different guy now. Speaking of our subject for today.
Him and Scott Bio break my heart, man.
Problematic faves, which is what we're going to be talking about in the episode. Anyway, Republicans have been calling out things like Gina Carano being fired, cancel culture, and saying it's out of control. But some other people have been calling it consequences culture. I do think we should be talking about our problematic faves and how we can hold people accountable for their views. And how does life and art mix in this case?
Well, we're going to talk about that today with 2 fantastic writers. Later in the show, we'll be joined by Matt Gallagher, who was on the very first episode of Fiction Nonfiction. Matt's the author of a recent and much talked about Intercept article about the book and movie Cherry.
But first, we're thrilled to have Meredith Talusan with us. Meredith is an award-winning journalist and author. They have written features, essays, and opinion pieces for publications including The New York Times, The Guardian, The Atlantic, Vice, Matter, Back Channel, The Nation, and The American Prospect. She has contributed to several books, including the New York Times bestselling Not That Bad, Dispatches from Rape Culture, edited by Roxane Gay. Her memoir, Fairest, is out now from Viking Penguin Random House. Meredith, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Meredith, I so appreciated reading Fairest, which is about your experiences of gender and transitioning, and also your alienation from your community in the Philippines as a result of your albinism. We wanted to have you on to talk about problematic faves and writing in the face of transphobia. And then because I was reading in the wake of the news about the shootings of Asian American women in Atlanta. And so that was very much on my mind as I was reading about your experience dressing as a woman for the first time. So I wonder if you could start us off with our conversation by reading that passage for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So this passage is from I read on an iPad because I have low vision and have a hard time reading my own book. But this is from the prologue of Fairest, and it describes the first time that I ever dressed as a woman, somewhat unintentionally, which was for this ritual at Harvard on Halloween in Adam's house called Drag Night. And then after Drag Night, I went to a club called Man Ray in Central Square in Boston. And then I took the T back to Harvard Square. And this is a description of what happened. It was an unusually warm fall night, but the temperature had turned chilly over the last several hours, and I had to hug myself for warmth. I was about a block away from my dorm entrance when I became aware of a rumbling sound, unusually close to the sidewalk. then the honk of a horn. I kept walking, figuring the noise had nothing to do with me. But as I got closer to my house and the street got quieter, I began to hear yelling from several young men. "Turn around," I heard one of the voices say. I paused and swiveled my head in their direction, where I saw figures so dimly lit that they looked like shadows, crawling by in a giant early model American car. "Hey, beautiful," someone from inside yelled. "Come ride with us," another said. I smiled and shook my head as I rested a hand on my cheek. "Not tonight," I replied, my voice suddenly breathy and high. I observed my thickened eyelashes bat before I turned around. It was only when I started walking again that I felt the sting of fear. I consciously pieced together what my instinct had already computed, that these young men had mistaken me for a woman, and I played my part to appease them. I also became aware that if one of these men had decided to get out of the car and examine me more closely, they would realize the mistake they'd made, and that this would make them angry, maybe angry enough to use their fists, and that it would be my body and not just my heels against the bricks. A deep part of me knew that running might incite them to chase me, and the safest choice was to walk at an even pace. It was a long half block of ignoring their shouts before I got to my dorm entrance. Lucy, my friend, had lent me a black beaded clutch, and I fumbled for the class before I was able to fish out my keys, the ones I had a hard time getting in the keyhole because of my weak eyes. I had learned to unlock the door by feel rather than sight. I brushed the keyhole with a shaking finger, then tried to fit my key into the slot. Seconds where each gust of wind felt like a man's breath, every failed jiggle like a trap I couldn't get out of. I turned myself into a ghost like I did as a child, without a body and free of fear, when my mother beat me or left me locked in my room overnight. The voices of those men, so loud only a few seconds before, sounded as if they came from the other end of a long tunnel, slippery as I tried to crawl out. Finally, my key found the hole, and I clicked the latch above the handle with my thumb, then opened the heavy door as fast as I could. I ran into a wall of fluorescent light and was suddenly afraid my broad shoulders would give me away. I hurried down the hallway and out of sight, started the climb up to my room as my heels made an almost clacking sound when they reverberated on the circular stairway. I only felt safe once I closed the door to my suite, as physical sensation returned to my limbs, and I realized how much my feet hurt. I went to my bedroom to take off my shoes, relieved that neither of my two roommates were there to see me. I felt ashamed somehow to have attracted attention and then gotten so scared. I would turn the incident into a good story at brunch the next day, how some straight guys followed me home because they thought I was a hot girl. But that night, I just wanted to live with the fear and shame on my own, without the need to transform my experience into a witty anecdote. I sat on the bed and took off my heels, rubbed my feet as I reflected on how tired they were, how nervous I still was as my palm alighted on my chest and I felt my heartbeat slow to a normal pace. Yet as I recalled my fear, there also grew in me a surprising, pleasant sensation, and I smiled despite myself, fascinated at the sudden feeling that the experience had been worth it. Those men were convinced I was a woman, and I became curious about what they saw. I left my bedroom and crossed our empty common room to turn on the bathroom light and look at myself in the mirror. But my face was too hard, the light too harsh up close. So I took a step back, and then another, and then a few more, until I could only see my face as a sketch whose details my imagination could fill. The colors were more pronounced than I was used to, my eyes and lips outlined in smoke and red. I noticed the pleasant semicircle of my dress's neckline against my chest and imagined graceful clavicle. Though I did see that my neck was thin and long, something I never paid attention to before. All evening, people had told me I looked like a real girl, and those anonymous men had given me proof. But it was only then, in that bathroom mirror, that I perceived a glimmer of what they saw. From afar, I felt like a girl to myself, even a beautiful girl.
Meredith, thank you so much for that reading. I had such a visceral, embodied reaction to reading that because I was mentioning to you before the interview, I've been to the club that you write about there, and I've walked that walk back, and I thought about violence against women and also how trans women of color have been especially vulnerable. You write about in Fairest the privilege of passing as white and also about the power of being seen as a woman in that moment. Can you talk a little bit about how we write about and imagine Asian women and the recent uptick in violence?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, just because I am in this unique position of being Asian, having grown up in the Philippines, like being surrounded by Asian people, in an Asian family, and yet at the same time being regularly perceived as white, and being perceived as a particular kind of white woman, like a blonde white woman, blondness being also associated with a particular kind of privilege and innocence, right? And I do think that one of the things that really stuck with me about the incidences of anti-Asian violence and just in general, how the white gaze represents Asian people, is that in comparison, people talk a lot about Asian women being over sexualized, right? Which is also the case for Black women, which is also the case for trans women. And there's also, I think, there's this really particular degree of objectification, right? That we, especially for the sort of like dominant white patriarchal gaze, we become symbolic in a way that I think is more difficult for white men, particularly, to symbolize white women, because they actually interact with white women and they're more likely to have affinities to white women. And so one of the things that throughout my life I've come to, sort of like see actually and be really privy to, is the shift in people's behaviors towards me, when men's behaviors towards me, when they find out that I'm trans, when they find out that I'm Asian, that I can literally, like see in their faces and their expressions all of the, kind of like symbolic weight of that, all of their associations around, like trans women, like automatically assumed to be more sexually adventurous, right? Or, like Asian women being more exotic and, like being privy to, like sexual practices that are not, kind of like known to white men. And so I think that, like that's been something that's been really present for me in terms of seeing the ways in which the victims of the shooting were literally erased, right? That there's a sort of assumption of passivity. There's this assumption of especially working class Asian women who, are potentially sex workers. There's this sense in which, well, no, like these people aren't important. Their race isn't important. Their deaths aren't important. Let's focus on the fact that, like this white guy had a bad day and that he's a sex addict, right? And I feel like literature is an extension of that, right? Like the ways in which, like the ways in which, for like the for whatever reason, because, well, not for whatever reason, because it's such a, like an important part of my life, like Miss Saigon really jumps out at me, like as a representation, and like Madame Butterfly, Puccini, M. Butterfly, the David Henry Hwang play, all of the variations of that trope, right? Just because of the fact that that is like a really that is a representation of the sort of like whitened gaze, right? That the Asian woman is the sort of, is this sort of like passive creature that then, that is then, just like hoping to be chosen, like hoping for this sort of like love of this white man who would then, like take care of all of her needs. And, and in that particular play, the white man is presented in Miss Saigon, the white man is presented as innocent, right? Like as a victim of circumstance, rather than, rather than what is much more typical of white men in that position, right? Which is that as a person who exoticizes Asian women and then, and then just sort of like leaves them, and doesn't really necessarily care about the consequences.
I was thinking about, as you're talking, I was realizing, I don't know how this book didn't occur to me before, but I was thinking about Marguerite Duras' The Lover, as also just, I mean, like canonical exotification, if that's even a phrase that I want to invent.
Right.
And I remember also seeing yesterday on Twitter, I mean, I'm trying to remember which opera this was, someone was advertising Madame Butterfly like yesterday. And I don't know, this seems like I felt a little bit like read the room.
Right.
Like maybe not the time.
Right. The Mikado, and it's a really, and one of the things that's been really wonderful is the way in which, kind of like there's been such a plethora of recent Asian American literature and Asian American fiction. Like we have Woman Warrior, and we have, Kathy Park Hong, and we have, like we have Julia Tsuka, we have all of these ways in which we can, like we have represented ourselves. And yet at the same time, we also need to ask about, kind of like larger mainstream representations, and the fact that these tropes are still, are still so present in our culture, right?
Yeah, I was just looking up. I had noticed, and I'm going to call it up so I don't like misquote. I noticed, R.O. Kwan, who's been on our show before, and she actually retweeted a tweet that you had on her Twitter line, but she had a guy comment, on one of her tweets saying that this is not a racist incident, it's about sex trafficking, right? But the point that you're making here is that these two things are intertwined in a white guy's mind.
Yeah, because that is how
right. That's what I'm trying to
racist,
say. Like,
right?
That's how
like
he's being racist by connecting those two things, right?
Right.
He can't say that they're separated, right? And then to say that is exactly on point of the problem here.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is a really typical experience for me, like as both an Asian person and as a trans person, right? Like when cis women say, oh, like I'm not, like I don't have a problem with you being trans, I have a problem with you being assertive, right? And and I tell people, well, like trans women are not socialized in the same ways as cis women are, right? So is it possible that you're viewing my assertiveness through the lens of your knowledge about my trans identity, right? And also, like what are the factors? Because in the cultural climate that we're in, it isn't necessarily like not that many people will say, oh yeah, like I'm racist against Asian people, and these are my motives. Like you can always obscure your motivations using, quote unquote behaviors, right? Like we've had this conversation around, like, and continue to have these conversations about, like Black people and the use of the term urban, right? And the, the use of coded words to describe people's behaviors. Yeah.
That guy is saying this is only just about sex trafficking because the women are Asian, right? That is part of the reason why he is saying that.
Right. And the, and the specific, parlor that he targeted was called like Young Asians Massage Parlor, right? It's very frustrating because it's a really common way in which white people deflect charges of racism is by saying no, like I'm not racist, like I am merely judging somebody through a racist trope, but I'm not judging them because they're Asian. I'm judging them because they do X and X and X and Y.
Right. Well said. That was what I was trying to get to. I like that phrasing better. All right. What about how we imagine and write about trans women? It seems to me that transphobia is becoming sort of a plank of the Republican Party in a certain way, and has been like sort of, it also is coming up in the culture, You know, there was the Harper's letter. Was that last summer, Sugi? How long ago was the Harper's letter?
Time is a soup. I have no idea.
It was during the
I have
pandemic
yeah.
at some point. Was signed by J.K. Rowling, who had been criticized for transphobic statements, and the transgender writer Jennifer Finney Boylan, among others, took her signature off of it. So, and in the UK, you know, transphobia is a big part of mainstream feminism, right? So we're seeing, there's the Marjorie Taylor Greene incident. I'm sure you saw her putting that sign up outside of her office. What is it? There's only two genders. Is that what the sign said?
Yeah.
So what is happening in the culture when we're seeing this this issue be weaponized as a political point?
I do feel like after gay marriage, right? Like after 2015, after, you know, like with the increasing acceptance of gay, lesbian, and bisexual people into, you know, like into the cultural norm or the cultural mainstream, you know, Republicans and fundamentalists are looking for new people to demonize, right? And there's this really convenient, you know, demographic of people to do that with, namely trans people, for various reasons. You know, like one is that they can invoke children. You know, like there's always, you know, whenever children are involved, you know, all of these, you know, like all of these, you know, tropes start to come out in terms of trans people as predators, trans people as converters, et cetera, et cetera. The other is that, you know, is that there are factions within the feminist community who are also transphobic, J.K. Rowling being one of them. And so I feel like, you know, like there is this really concerted effort, you know, to put trans people you know, to like position trans people as the new, you know, like boogeyman in terms of, you know, like in terms of all of these cultural debates, right? And I think the way in which that converges with things like the Harper's letter, things like, you know, things like writers coming out with, you know, with transphobic views, J.K. Rowling, Chimamanda Adichie, for example, are two examples that I can think of. Anne Lamott. There's this way in which, you know, people, there's this sort of writers in America are really, really conscious of this idea of, you know, like freedom of the press, you know, that you know, self-censorship is dangerous, you know, we as writers should be able to write what we want, you know, without, you know, we should have the freedom to express ourselves, which are all, you know, like really what you, but we have to evaluate the context in which those values are being expressed, right? You know, so that, you know, with the Harper's letter, when you're in the middle of this racial reckoning around George Floyd, is it really the right time, you know, to completely flatten all of these issues? You know, when you have demographics of people who like literally self-censor all the time, you know, like I, for instance, was the first trans staff writer at BuzzFeed, and I worked as the only trans person in an office of 500 people. Imagine how much self-censorship that required, you know, like when you're like the only minority in a room all the time, right? You know, so there are these ways in which, you know, like I feel like white cis people are being held to the same standard that minorities have always had to navigate. And they're finding it very difficult, it seems. And, you know, like, and in terms of, you know, like writers wanting to be transphobic, you know, I've just always said, you know, like there are degrees to which you can express your opinions, right? And to me, the point at which, you know, the point at which I react is if you're questioning my my ability to be who I am, right? Like my existence in the world, right? And I think that people like J.K. Rowling are doing that. So
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear you talk about this and think about all of the ways that, I mean, I remember I was reading, I think it was a New York Times piece about how British feminism became anti-trans. And it was sort of talking about, right, like there's all this rhetoric of kind of purity and, you know, like feminism is for women. And then there's like right behind that, of course, is the notion that trans women are not women. Whereas like, why would it, so it's putting forward the idea that that including trans women in feminism is somehow extra, or that it is decreasing space for feminism, whereas it's actually expanding it. So it's totally backwards. And it was really surprising to me to realize the ways in which kind of like across the pond, this is like a very normal, like so-called progressive way to discuss it, which just doesn't make a lot of sense and also isn't backed up by like a lot of data, like as you say, the boogeyman, right? And then sorry,
Go
Whitney,
ahead.
go ahead.
I know. I want to add. I just want to ask about like, see, I have trans students in class, and that's one of the reasons that we're doing this episode because we have some student interns who work on the show, and this was an idea that they brought forward to us, which I thought was a great idea, but you know, they are really mad. And is it rolling or rowling? I never can remember which I'm supposed. I know it's something weird, and then I always say it wrong. But we'll just say it's one of those, and we don't care about her name anyway because she's being a pain in the ass. But you know, they are very angry. In part because you know the Harry Potter series is an immensely read text, right? And so when I'm trying to look for examples of commonly read books to you know, like I use Star Wars, I use, you know, but JK, the Harry Potter were books that I used, right, just as examples in class because I thought everyone will have read these. And now, you know, students have said, you know, we really don't want you to talk about that writer. And I'm like, that is fine with me. I don't have any investment in talking about Harry Potter. It wasn't my favorite book anyway. But, you know, it's interesting to me how much her reputation has changed. I mean, were you a Harry
right.
Potter reader prior to you know, her
No,
political?
I mean, thankfully I dodged that bullet. You know, like I literally was just like, whew, you know, like I have not really invested. I think I read maybe like the first couple of books, but I haven't, you know, like I don't have that, you know, kind of like investment of soul that you know, that other people have. And I think, you know, like I think it was actually Jenny Boylan on Twitter who was talking about the fact that, you know, that she has students and she has, you know, she has young, she knows young trans people, you know, like who grew up on these books, and imagine, you know, like how they're feeling now. But, you know, I have to say, you know, like I love Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, and I recently learned that she you know, like during the time that Caitlyn Jenner was transitioning, was really adamant that she wasn't going to gender Caitlyn Jenner she until, you know, until she had, you know, gender confirmation surgery. Or, you know, like you have, you know, like you have, I am deeply, deeply in love with Americana as a novel of migration, and you know, just as a sort of like masterwork of fiction. And yet, you know, Chimamanda Adichie has expressed a lot, both agreement with J.K. Rowling, and is really like, you know, just sort of like talking about this whole kind of like idea that trans women are fundamentally different as women than cisgender women, right? Like, however you want to constitute, you know, like what it means to be a woman, or like how you want to use these terms. And I think that's something that I've had to, you know, that I've had to wrestle with, you know, the fact that there are authors who I love who also, you know, just routinely say and do things that, you know, that I find terrible. And I think, and we have to wrestle with that, you know, like that's something that, because otherwise, you know, like you just stop having anything that you like or that you can appreciate, right? like I was reading Giovanni's Room recently, and it has like really phobic descriptions of, like what would now be called trans women. Like at the time they were probably classified as effeminate gay men. And like to what degree are those descriptions reflective of James Baldwin's own opinions, right?
Yeah, these are really hard questions. And I think, these are some of the reasons we were interested in doing this episode. I mean, I remember recently, I love Adrienne Rich, and I actually had a quote from Adrienne Rich as the epigraph of my novel. And she was on the syllabus of a class I taught in the fall. And then I was told by someone I really respect, that she had been supportive of transphobia and was a trans exclusionary radical feminist. And so I took her off the syllabus and was like, I'm going to go do a bunch of homework. And I took her out of the epigraph of the novel that I'm working on. And I was kind of like, this phrase has meant so much to me for so long. And also it definitely cannot be in front of the story that I'm about to tell. Like that's not
See, this is news to me, another person that I have to, sort of like think about, who I admire. But that's the thing is that, like being a trans person, honestly, it's just like you walk around enjoying all of these things, and then like all of a sudden there's just like a transphobic joke, and there's all of a sudden, like it's just like such a typical experience where, like where you would just have this sort of like random moment of phobia in like whatever entertainment you happen to be enjoying. This is also true, by the way, in terms of albino tropes, that it always happens that like whenever you have like, there's just like a bunch of representations in books and media where it's just like, oh, like you want to like highlight this character as particularly evil, like just make them albino.
Yeah.
Right.
I had a student who wrote a brilliant paper just last week that we were workshopped as an essay, but it was about her experiences watching and finding transphobia in movies, and going back and thinking about, she described a scene in Ace Ventura: Pet Detective that is completely insane. I had not seen that movie, so I did not. But I also remember The Crying Game, which was a huge movie a while ago, and she was talking about sort of transphobic tropes that are in that film. And it was amazing to think about how present that is in popular culture of just a decade ago,
right.
Or more.
The 40-year-old version, but also really, really recently, like I feel like, just even now, you still have these, like you still have jokes and that are really ill-considered, and like it's just very hard. Like I feel like part of the problem, right, is people want to be able to, to express themselves in parody, but we live in a cultural context in which there is so much inequality and there's so much privilege that's entailed in being in a position of power, that what minorities are saying is, like my position is always like, if we lived in a culture in which, like I can make fun of white people as much as they can make fun of me, and that, like the cultural effects of those parodies would be the same, and that, like the viewership for those parodies would be the same, then, we wouldn't have a problem, right? But the problem is that, like so consistently, what happens is like the gaze is situated in such a way that it becomes very difficult to, like yesterday I tweeted something like, like, aren't you all, don't you like stay up at night thinking about like cisgender kids staying cisgender and like not learning about, like what it means to live as other genders, and like propagating, sort of like, propagating toxic masculinity and patriarchy. And there was actually like a person who took me seriously and was just like, well, no, like it's, like it's important for people to be themselves, et cetera, et cetera. And I just feel like there's this way in which, part of what it means to make fun of minorities relies on the fact that you have kind of like a mainstream majority agreeing with you, right? Like, because otherwise, otherwise that whatever you're saying would not land as a joke, right? And I think that that's part of, like the tension and the push and pull that we're experiencing in a lot of these cultural conversations.
And then it's interesting, you get people talking about like, oh, I've expressed myself and now like the left is out to cancel me. And then you also get, right, like we're also trying to have conversations about like hashtag own voices or authenticity and a range of complex conversations about that. And people are also reflecting on how they're expressing themselves with regard to those things. And I feel like the way that the GOP has weaponized the term cancel culture has like gotten in the way of some of the complexity of the writerly conversations that we might be having about that. So I was thinking, and I went and looked this up to be like, was I remembering this right? There was a YA novel called Blood Heir, which is by an Asian author, Amelie Wenzhou. And she had written a novel that was a fantasy based in a fantasy world. And I should clarify also that I haven't read this. I read the article about it, and it's set in a fantasy world. And she had based it in part on things like sex trafficking and human trafficking, and like was coming from this Asian context. And then sort of people who had read the novel sort of in beta or whatever in the YA world were criticizing it as insensitive towards slavery. And I think we're reading it maybe in a different context. And so she pulled it. She canceled it, and then sort of went back and looked at some of the criticism and decided that by and large, there were a lot of things that she didn't agree with. She thought that the book could still be published. And then she made some other changes with the aid of sensitivity readers. But it's like, there's a real difference, it seems to me, between criticizing something like that. And I don't know what the novel looked like right before and after, I'm not sure. And then criticizing someone like J.K. Rowling, who you can't actually cancel her. She's like made of money.
I looked it up, by the way. It's bowling, if you guys care.
Oh,
I found
okay. Well, it's J.K. Rowling.
Sounds like bowling.
Rolling.
It's rolling. Yeah.
J.K. made of money. Like, I mean, I'm being glib. I remember the story about, her as a working class mother, et cetera. But like, I think also like if someone like that, people are talking about, oh, J.K. Rowling is going to be canceled. Like, you can't cancel her. She's uncancelable.
And that also, like so many of these conservative commentators and people who have built their, like their platforms around, basically, like anti-trans, whatever, just, like doing all of these anti-trans articles, their profiles are raised by claiming that they're being canceled, right? Like, so you have Jesse Singal reportedly being paid by Substack, like an amount in the six figures in order to publish with them, et cetera, right? And so it is actually very difficult to cancel people, like Louis C.K. is, like is back doing shows, et cetera. And I think if you compare that to number of the careers that I've seen derailed or they completely like eradicated because of either white people or cis people or both, supervisors being terrible towards minorities, then I feel like this entire concern around like, oh, I'm being canceled is just really misplaced, right?
I mean, also, these are important conversations to have. I insist on their necessity, really. And so I remember all the headlines about that Fox News was doing about Dr. Seuss. Well, I mean, he had anti-Asian stereotypes in some of those books that were pulled. Why do you want to pull those books? Well, look what happened in Atlanta. I mean, do you want to contribute to that, or do you think we should have a conversation about it? Of course, we should have a conversation about it. And the idea that the right has somehow made this a talking point of negativity is wrong, in my view.
Well, yeah. And I think one of the really funny things about the Harper's letter is that while it is simultaneously calling for like more nuance and discussion, it was simultaneously also like flattening out all of these discussions, like it was saying, oh, like, this person's lecture was canceled, and like this person is like circulating a peer-reviewed article, and like they're being vilified. Oh, and like, let's compare that, to like the debates around race surrounding George Floyd, right? Like I feel like, there has to necessarily be room for, like for all of these debates and all of these discussions. And at the same time, like people should be aware that there are consequences, like when they perform certain actions, right? That like you can't expect to, to pen, like an open letter, completely invalidating the identities of, and, kind of like fundamental feelings about the genders of an entire huge group of people, and just say, oh, like like I don't want people, like not reading me anymore, right? That's just unreasonable. That's just consequence. But I think that a lot of times people, like I lived in a dictatorship. I lived in, like I grew up in the Marcos regime. Like I know what it's, like I'm aware of what it's like to like not have freedom of the press and freedom of expression. Like this is very different. Like the relative power of the people involved who are making these complaints is really different than, this sort of totalitarian state power. And I think people need to be really cognizant of that, right?
This has been a really fantastic conversation. I wish we could continue having it for hours. I just want to quote a little bit of this Harper's letter that you're referring to, because there's so much code just packed into it. It's like almost impressive. Editors are fired for running, more troubling still, institutional leaders in a spirit of panicked damage control are delivering hasty and disproportionate punishments instead of considered reforms. Editors are fired for running controversial pieces. I think that's about James Bennett. Books are withdrawn for alleged
and Ian Buruma as well.
And yes, and Ian Buruma as well. Books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity. Journalists are barred from writing on certain topics. Professors are investigated for quoting works of literature in class. I can only imagine that this refers to professors who quote literature that has the N-word in it. A researcher is fired for circulating a peer-reviewed academic study, and the heads of organizations are ousted for what are sometimes just clumsy mistakes. And so, further down here, it talks about we need to preserve the possibility of good faith disagreement without dire professional consequences. But I think, as you point out, so many minorities have been disagreeing with dire professional consequences for a very long time. And yeah, I mean, I think that you raise so many very valuable points about this, and it's been such a treat to have you with us. I really, really appreciate it. And listeners, we just want to encourage you to pick up Meredith's terrific memoir, Fairest, out from Penguin Random House. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.